Again, this is the athlete panel, and Uphill Pursuits and I kind of started developing this idea, number one, because we're now doing all of these meetings via Zoom or GoToMeetings or over the computer. But because we just wanted to bring folks together and recognize the power of making a connection, even though it is over the computer, but also providing an inspirational piece, because these times it's good to have inspiration. Tuck a little inspiration in your pocket, save it for later if you don't need it right now. And what a better way to start off with the athlete panel than to have a bunch of women come together. And so when we were kind of hatching this idea, we had the thought of not necessarily covering nuts and bolts and talking about, training and how much weight do you lift and, what snacks do you eat, even though that is a very important part of all of our lives. I think it gets overdone. And so we wanted to create an evening, or at least an hour, that talked about more existential things and kind of deeper things as to why we do sports and why we do mountain sports. So that's kind of the format we came up with for this evening. And so what we've got is a bunch of questions that either I've come up with or we've come up with as a group that we're going to talk about in this panel. And I believe GoToMeetings has like a comment box where if something comes up for you and you want it to be addressed later, certainly write a comment, shoot us a question. I will definitely save some time at the end of the evening to answer any questions. And aim them towards certain people. If you have a question for Gilbert or a question for me or a question, for the entire panel, just shoot it in the little comment box and we will take care of that. So that's kind of how the next hour or so is going to go. And so without further ado, I wanted to introduce our panel members. And once I give you all their names, we're going to ask everybody just to say a couple quick sentences about themselves, even though we're all kind of uncomfortable talking about themselves. This is a totally fine time to do that. And then we'll start talking about some stuff. So first I've got Emily Kipp, and this is a cool panel because we have some ladies who don't really go by their first name, which is rad. So Kipp's the first one. Tell us about yourself.
Okay, you guys, what should I say here? Well, I grew up in Vermont and then I moved to Montana for more of a grander adventure and bigger mountains. I moved to Bozeman to start the mountain project with Mike Wolf, and I love pedaling my bicycle more than anything.
Perfect. Thanks, Kipp. And Kipp brings a really neat perspective to this panel because both Kipp and Jeannie have done a bunch of endurance sports. So Jeannie's more on the Nordic side and skimo. And while alpinism and mountaineering is definitely endurance-based, it's not necessarily against another competitor necessarily, human competitor. So I like the combination of having Kipp and Jeannie here too, because they bring something different to the table. So next is Gilbert-Chase, and Gilbert, tell us about you.
Well, yeah, I live here in Bozeman. I've been here for about 12 years. I grew up in Virginia on the Chesapeake Bay, and it wasn't until college that I started rock climbing, and that kind of quickly went into the bigger mountains and ice climbing, and kind of one thing led to another. And yeah, I've kind of spent my life since I started climbing just seeking adventures in the hills, and both near and far. I've always loved traveling and always loved adventure, and I've been fortunate to combine those two into both a career and a passion. And I've climbed all over the world and met many people and experienced many other cultures, and it's been a wonderful wonderful experience. And I've also been fortunate to be grounded here in Bozeman and work as a nurse, which is interesting times these days with everything that's going on. And but I feel fortunate that I've had something besides just a house to kind of be here and make my community of Bozeman and to make it my home. And so, yeah. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight.
And thanks, Gilbert, for holding down the fort over at Deaconess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
And finally, we have Jeannie Wall. Jeannie.
Let's see, Midwest gal. Spent my youth as the youngest of 11 kids running away from my older siblings. So yeah, Flatlander, and got into Nordic and just kind of became an endurance junkie, running and biking and Nordic skiing and running A racing for years. And then lucked out and came to Bozeman with a job with Patagonia in '94 and got more and more into the mountains and climbing. And now that's kind of my full-time passion is any kind of climbing. And Becky's schooling me on how to project. And all you women out there are totally my heroes that I can see in the photos right now, and others. So yeah, thanks for being here. It's really nice to see some great faces, and I feel lucky to live here and be near the mountains, and I big backcountry skier and just kind of addicted to being outside, really.
Yeah, I think that's an okay addiction to have right now. Great. So that gives us a brief rundown of who we've got. And like I said, we didn't want this panel to be too super specific. We just wanted to have some mountain athletes. And I think we've done a really good job of covering a plethora of different subsets of what it means to be an athlete in the mountains. And so with that, you know, part of what we want to talk about is kind of sort of what sport is to us and how we express ourselves in the mountains. And I asked these guys before this evening to come up with a good question that a younger version of themselves, let's say 18-year-old Emily Kipp, would ask a panel such as this as she was racing mountain bikes or getting into long mountain runs. And I think we came up with some really good topics to start off the evening. And I wanted to start with Kip's question, actually, that she wanted to ask the panel. And maybe I can aim this towards Jeannie, because I think she has such a variety of experiences in the mountains. This would be a great one for Jeannie. And the question is, why is your sport, be it alpinism, climbing, or maybe even Nordic during that time in your life, why is your sport important to you?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best one to answer that. So many different things that, like, where I am today is so different. But if I were to go back to racing, you know, I think I just had too much energy. So as much as I loved the mountains, I was just really driven to move, you know, move in them and move myself outside so much that I kind of gravitated toward more trail running racing, you know, Nordic racing. And so those were important to me because they were a great outlet for frustrations of things that I grew up with, maybe parents who didn't get along real well and stuff in my family life. And not that it was bad, but just, you know, it was a great outlet. And I had a lot of energy. So, you know, of course, as I raced, it became important to try to win or compete better and better. But really, you know, I remember going to the Olympic trials for Nordic in Anchorage, and I'd done like 6 races in my life, and all I could do was look up at Denali and go, why am I not up there? And why am I running around like a rat in a cage down here? But so I kind of struggled for a long time, and maybe still do, but climbing's really helped me with this, is I kind of always wanted to be somewhere I wasn't. And part of the gift of maybe loving a whole bunch of different sports, from windsurfing at that time to cross-country skiing and running, you know, the crutch of it was that I always wanted to be doing something else if the weather was better for that. So the importance of those things was mainly just getting me outside and a good outlet for everything, and the importance of just learning camaraderie and how to work with others and on a team. I mean, all those things kind of fell into place. I think climbing is so important in my life now because I've grown and learned so much from my partners in the community of climbing, and it's cliche, but it really is a community and a tribe, and it's more than just a sport. And that's more important to me than the physical aspect of climbing. But the combination of the mental challenge with the physical is, I think, now where I've landed, as that combined with the community, and that it's a lifetime pursuit that you can take in so many different forms, hopefully, as long as I'm moving some limb, makes that really poignant and kind of just so meaningful in my life right now. And really, it's the people, I mean, that make the difference to me.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks for those thoughts. So Gilbert, I think even though you could probably say many of those things that Jeannie said, I would love to hear your take on it, especially since a lot of the expeditions you go on are, quite small. And I think climbing and mountaineering sometimes can be categorized as more of a selfish sport. Sometimes it's miscategorized as such. But why is climbing and alpinism important to you?
Well, I learned how to climb when I was in college, and I spent sort of the teen years sort of a lost kid and sort of a reckless kid, and it kind of culminated in college, and I just was searching, I think, for a long time of something besides sort of the stereotypical college life and high school life and things that I was doing, and I found climbing, and I think it was sort of the right place, the right time, and it spoke to me not only from a physical outlet of, I had always been a physical kid and loving sport, and so I think climbing initially spoke to me because of that, but it also required so much focus and dedication to learn something new. And I think if everyone here has tried climbing or knows climbing or any other sport, it takes a lot at the beginning to sort of understand the sport. And for me, it filled this void that was present in my life. And it just sort of became the main driver for a long time. And I was very focused on climbing itself and wanting to learn more and push myself, and not only the pushing the grades and things like that, but also the disciplines and learning different aspects of climbing. And then after a while, after a handful of years where I felt like I'd sort of gained this big set of knowledge around climbing and everything that there was, I started to realize how much more climbing was than just the sport. And for me, that was the community in which I did it with, the climbing partners that I spent hours and days with. And then as that morphed into these massive expeditions where I go and live in a tent with somebody or one or two people for 6 weeks with the sole motivation to climb one mountain. Yeah, a lot of people think it's crazy, and it probably is, but I think it's all the lessons that are created on that journey, from learning how to navigate life with one or two people for that long when you're going crazy. And then also just experiencing how other people live and the communities that are around the world. And it's I think been one of the biggest factors in my life of just realizing that we're all human and being able to connect with people that may seem so different on so many levels, but at the end of the day, when I'm sitting in a base camp and I have a bunch of Pakistani men there that I can't even understand the language they're speaking, and we really have nothing in common, and before you know it, we're playing charades, trying to figure out, we're trying to teach each other card games, we're learning how to cook together, we're just kind of doing all these basic human activities that bring us joy. And yeah, I think for me, that's been by and far the most important thing, is just that connection with people from my climbing partner on the other end of the rope, to the people I've met around the world. And I've been fortunate that those lessons and what I've learned from that has sort of gone into my personal life and how I want to live my life. And so yeah, I think it's pretty cool how one simple thing of rock climbing has sort of taken my life into many different directions.
Yeah, for sure. Good thoughts on that. Thanks. That's a great question, Kip. Simple, but to the point. So as you guys were talking, I was thinking of a question actually that Jeannie and I have talked about quite a bit this week. And it has to go backwards, and it has to do with going backwards in time and kind of thinking about our early motivations as to how we got into whatever mountain sport that we're into, whether it's running or climbing. But Jeannie came up with a great question that she wanted to pose to everybody, and maybe this one's a good one for you to start out with, Kip, because it's pretty all-encompassing and it has to do with motivation. And I think that just behind Jeannie's question was we were trying to figure out where the passion and the motivation and the drive comes from for people. Is it your environment? Is it genetics? Is there some sort of like life-changing mentor? Is there some sort of event maybe that happened? But where do you think, for mountain athletes, for people who like to push it in the hills, I guess it's maybe a nature nurture question. And how would you feel about, could you place a priority like, this is just my genetics that I do these things? Or are there some sort of events that take place as we're young or growing up that kind of push us this direction? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think all those things can play a role into that answer. I think for me specifically, I think it was genetic and not necessarily from my parents per se, but I do feel like I was born with this innate will or want to go very hard from a very young age. At 5, I saw Iron Man on the television, and at that age, I knew I was going to do that. I was like, oh, I'm going to go do that. And really, I mean, from when I can even start to remember, I tried to go as hard as I could all the time. And so for me specifically, it's just kind of ingrained in me. But that said, I do think it can be a learned thing where maybe you haven't experimented with it, or you go out and you try, and sometimes it's getting over a hump. Sometimes people they might have a goal to do a marathon, for example, and they've never done anything like it. And through the process, I feel like they can learn to feel what I feel. Maybe they weren't necessarily like born with that feeling, and it can be a learned behavior. I could go on and on about this, but
So I'm hearing that for you, there was something genetically there where you just wanted to keep pushing.
yes.
Mm-hmm. But maybe not for everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And in my heart, I mean, one of the reasons why I do what I do is because I'm so happy, and it makes me feel so good that I want to share that with everyone. And I've learned that that's definitely possible. And I believe that anyone can get into this and really love it.
Mm-hmm. Jeannie, did you want to add any thoughts about kind of what we've talked about in the past week and this topic of nature versus nurture, genetics? Yeah. Can this be a learned passion? Can people develop passion as they go?
Well, I think like Kip said, they're all, they can be all encompassed. We can encompass all of them, or one of them might be the main driver. I would pose the question to Gilbert, because I think it really interests me, how, and I put on there even kind of hormone shifts in our lives as women, which was another part of kind of an extension of the question, how that affects our drive and motivation. But I think like Kipp, you know, I sort of felt like I came out of the womb running. And then I've actually tried to slow myself down, or been told to slow down a lot. And so there's pros and cons, and then we have life, you know, we have the environment we grew up in, and the environment we spend our, you know, people we spend our time with. So women like Gilbert, who might not speak so much in climbing, or you, or others in this audience, that's the environmental side for certain has had a big effect. But I think for someone like Gilbert, I would ask you, like you, especially going into alpinism and such, do you feel like that was an something innate in you that you've had all your life, that kind of, or a certain personality trait that is more genetic, or was it an influence, a familial influence, like how you grew up with your mom and dad and your family, and how that kind of positioned you to be driven and confident in alpinism? And I will say, especially as a woman, because it's a small field, you know.
I definitely think it's a mixture. I think it's both. You know, if you look at the sport of alpinism, there's a lot of suffering involved, and I think you have to want to be able to suffer, because otherwise it's like, well, why not just go rock climbing? Like, you know, right now, like it's beautiful, it's awesome. You can still try hard in that like amount of climbing that you're doing, but at the end of the day, you put on flip-flops, you drink a beer, you go home and sleep in your bed. And so I think in order to like, there's certain sports, or it's like, yeah, you could go out and mountain bike like 20 miles and kind of push it, but come home at the end of the day, or you could go on these extremely long 100+ mile mountain bike rides and suffer for extended period. And so I do think that there has to be a certain amount of that that's like either ingrained in you or like you're born with. And I didn't start climbing until I was older, and so, you know, I can't speak to that, but I do know that I used to race sailboats as a kid, and I remember I used to go out in winds that were like way too strong for me, and I could hardly, like, you know, when I was little, I was racing these little laser sailboats, like I hardly weighed enough in the boat itself, and then add a really strong wind, like I knew it was going to be a challenge. And so I would capsize left and right, and I deal with trying to manage the boat and all these things, but I loved that amount of, like, I loved the challenge of it and wanting to like prove to myself that, like, you know, I could sail that sailboat and I could kind of like manage in those winds. And so, yeah, I think like it's just something you're psyched on. It's like, you know, you love to run, you had all this energy as a kid and you had to expend it in some way. And that's just through our lives, and it's changed and it's evolved into different sports. But, you know, I would say that everyone here, not only us on this panel, but everyone listening, like everyone has their sport and everyone has their drive and their passion. And I think when it becomes something that you're just in love with, whether it's a sport or writing or gardening or whatever, like you put your whole heart into it and you're willing to like kind of,
is that right?
A little bit, if that's what it is. So yeah, I think it's both, but I do think that having a community helps, right? Like, you know, we have days where we're not motivated, and maybe you go out to the cliff with a friend and you're climbing and you're like, oh, I really need to climb today, but I'm just not motivated. But like seeing how excited your climbing partner is, or how motivated, and like watching them send, it like gets you more motivated. And so I do think there's a large part of here. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I really liked the touching on, I think, Kipp, you know, we could go as far as saying a sprint triathlon could compare to an Ironman as cragging for rock climbing would compare to alpinism. Is that pretty fair? You've got your sprint triathlon and your fair weather cragging, kind of like these very nice, comfortable events where you can go home at the end of the day and feel pretty good about yourself, versus your Ironman, where it's just a lot of grueling suffering, and mountain climbing are probably in the same category. Is that pretty fair? I think that's a fair comparison in my head, anyway.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
since we're all in a little bit different arena of sports, I'd say Gilbert and I are fairly similar, but there's something in this that I think is also interesting to me. I wish we could have the whole audience of women here answer this. There's some background noise. Somebody
Yeah, I think, hey, Nancy, turn your microphone off. There we go.
And that has to do with fear, and it's, so there's real fear of like the risks that we take in alpinism in the mountains and the risk of dying. There's also the real fear of, can I do this? Can I do an Ironman? Is, you know, should I even start it? I might drown in the water, or I might, you know, not finish, or and I guess this question, if it's at all of interest, would be sort of how, especially as women, because I think it's real that there, especially in climbing, there's probably more fear that limits women, even if it's just fear of not being confident, or how we all overcome that. And, you know, some of that can be you're just born, you know, without as much of it. And a lot of women, you know, the women climbers who are big soloists in the mountains and stuff, there aren't that many, but I assume that those women just aren't even born with that kind of fear. Most of us have some levels of fear that, you know, one of the beauties of climbing for me is trying to overcome that, like figure out what's real and what's not, and learning from now my, you know, inspirations, friends who are climbers like Gilbert and you, who have kind of helped me break down sort of barriers that I put up for myself, essentially. But maybe Kipp and Gilbert can speak to this and sort of, you know, that, because I think you two have gotten to a level in your sports that's really high level, and it's really inspiring, and it's like probably a lot of us physically are capable of doing certain things that we're still too fearful to go after. So maybe speak to that on some level if we can.
You have some thoughts, Kipp?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, I mean, for me, that's kind of what I get off on, is the fear. It's really fun to face that. Like, even now doing this interview, I'm like, my heart's pounding, like my adrenaline's going, but guess what? I kind of like it. And this is really scary. This is a lot scarier than doing, like, I don't know, some big 100-mile mountain bike race for me. So I'd say, you know, that's my personal take on it, is like, I actually like love the scariness of it, and facing it and accomplishing it. Yeah.
Gilbert, is there a way that you deal with things, fears?
Yeah, I think for me, always, like, I get scared, and I wouldn't, I'm not like Kipp, I don't get off on it. Like, I think it's pretty scary, you know, when things go wrong in the mountains, you know, whether a huge storm comes in that you weren't planning on having it come in, or you're 50 feet above your last piece of gear and the ice or rock or whatever is really bad. And yeah, I've had my moments of kind of, I don't know if freaking out's the right word, but sort of allowing that fear to take over. And I think for me, I've been able to compartmentalize that fear and like start to really understand it, and realize, like, if it's warranted fear and if it's real, like, you know, we all get scared on certain climbs, you know, if you're above your bolt and things like that, but it's like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? You're going to fall and your partner's going to catch you and everything's going to be okay. And it's like, you have to kind of work through that fear. And even if there are situations where, no, if you were to fall here, or if you got stuck out here in this situation, like, it's going to be really bad. But at the same time, I think you just have to compartmentalize and go through the motions and get yourself through that situation. And I think, yeah, there's a certain amount of skill with that. Like, if you're climbing on a certain pitch and you're scared because the gear's bad and the conditions are bad, like, you have to have the skills to get yourself through it, but you have to be able to also tell yourself that, you know what, this really isn't that hard. You can do it. Just go slow, take your time, like, get gear where you can, like, always talk with your partner. And yeah, I mean, I don't know how else to say it. I think it's like some of us do handle fear better than others, but I also think that the more you put yourself in uncomfortable situations, like the better you learn how to deal with them. You know, like, it's like falling is a big thing, right? They like teach clinics on how to fall, and we like talk through the mental breathing of how to fall, and you can like read books on it. But at the end of the day, like the only way you're gonna get better at it is to fall, to like try and to fail and like do it. And then all of a sudden it starts to click and you're like, oh, that wasn't so bad. My partner caught me. I didn't like break myself, and it like allows you to push harder. But I do think that fear is a real thing and everyone experiences it. It's just how we are able to like move through it.
Gilbert, do you think, so I was going to ask you both, you know, how did you learn to compartmentalize? Like, did somebody, besides just the experiences, was there anyone else involved, or your upbringing sort of, I think that's what I was getting at. Kipp, you sound like you sort of just feel like you're born with that stuff, and it's like you're born to just push yourself to the edge and like embrace that fear. And Gilbert, it sounds like you like maybe learn some of it, but some of it is also just sort of who you are and who you've been growing up and sort of moving through life.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of both. I think I'm probably a person that's always kind of been driven and wanted to like figure things out. And it's like, okay, if this is my goal, I'm going to get to that goal and I'm going to understand it. I mean, I think like nursing is like a big thing for me right now. Like this fall, I started working in the ICU, and you know, I went to nursing school here. I started nursing here, like a really small town, and I started working in the critical care realm like right before this whole COVID thing, you know, and I was like, I mean, talking about fear, like I was scared going into this when you're hearing and seeing what's happening around the world. And, you know, I was like, I'm a brand new critical care nurse. Like, am I going to be able to do this? And, you know, we've been fortunate here that I'm not working in New York City and stuff right now. But at the same time, it's like, I asked questions, I utilized the resources around me, and I started doing things to like gain the confidence to be able to have that skill set to like face this crisis that's happening. And yeah, I mean, I feel like if you'd asked me a handful of months ago, did I feel prepared? No, but like going through it, and I do feel more prepared. And I think the only way to do it is to dive in and like take care of these patients and do it. Same thing with our sports of like, to a certain extent, you just gotta like dive in and do it. And if you sign up to race 100 miles and you're like, you know, blow up at mile 50, well, hey, you tried, and you now know what you have to do next time to like do it. And maybe it takes you a couple times, right? Like it's taken me multiple times to climb certain mountains and routes and things like that, but it's like every time I do it, I learn something that helps overcome that fear, I think.
Yeah, I think the troubleshooting of that fear is what is so intriguing to me. Is just like listening to my own brain think through things to get through it. And there are definitely, I don't want to, you know, I might really enjoy this, but let me tell you, I get very scared, absolutely. And I think if like for those people who maybe haven't learned how to you know, troubleshoot those things, or I think reaching out, getting help from someone who does, and going out with them. And I feel like it's a great way to learn and face those fears with someone who feels confident in that realm, and they can kind of talk you through it. And I know like I've learned a lot from people just going out with them. It's not like I just go out by myself and like, you know, try to do something crazy. So yeah, just, you know, don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. I feel like that's a huge thing. Like if you want to do something, ask for help.
Yeah. And I'll definitely add to that what Kipp was ending with is that this is, I think, a time in the United States right now where coaching is a really big thing, and having a coach as an adult is really kind of cool. I worked with a climbing coach for a few years, and it's been so nice to have somebody to bounce stuff off of and to help me deal with some of those fears, you know, whether it's being afraid of not being successful or being afraid of actual technicalities on a climb, it's just really nice to have that community already set up for me. And so just to mirror what Kipp was saying, it is nice to have the ability to get a coach if you want one. It's not uncool and it's not scary. It's actually kind of fun. And in Bozeman and other mountain towns, I think our communities can be quite accepting of all abilities. And at least I feel it here, but like many of you, I've been in Bozeman such a long time that sometimes we get a false sense of security of what our community is like, but I believe our female athlete community here is very welcoming. So good point on that, Kipp, for sure. Because it is 6:40, I wanted to get to a really cool question that we came up with before we get to some chatting questions, and there are a couple and they're quite specific, so I wanted to for sure save some time for that. But for kind of our final group question from my list, and maybe we can start with who hasn't talked in a while. Jeannie, this is a good one for you. Do you approach your sport, say climbing, mountaineering, alpinism, the same way you approach life? Are there similarities? Are there differences? This can kind of tie into conquering fears, but also in other aspects of your sport. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I approach both similarly, which is maybe a downside to, well, down and upside to both. I think my nature is that I like a balance in my day and in my life. And so it's meant that I haven't pursued one thing with 100% of myself. And I think that's when you really can see what you can do, right? And you put yourself out there. And so that's probably the downside of loving to have a balance, whether that's just a little bit of climbing in a day plus a little bit of work and maybe a little bit of dinner with friends versus like, this is my day to go train and I'm going to do this and X, Y, and Z and be super disciplined. But I think my life's been like that too. I've made major compromises in my work because ladder climbing and even the exciting things that I could have done with work for me weren't worth compromising the time I needed to be able to live out my passions, even just day to day. And so I've always kind of I feel like made compromises on both sides. But at the same time, I feel really lucky that I've had the ability to have mostly part-time work the last dozen years that's allowed me to climb and, you know, have a life. So it's actually been a real good thing too. But you know,
I can attest to Jeannie being very good at crushing multiple aspects of her life on the regular.
Being jack of all and master of none. That's the trade-off.
Yeah.
It's good fun.
Yeah, Gilbert, do you approach climbing the same way you approach your life?
Yeah, definitely. I'm a pretty driven and focused person, and when I set my eyes on something, I think whether it's in my personal life, professional life, climbing life, whatever it may be, I think I kind of put 100% effort into it, and I think a lot of the time it works out for me, and I think the effort works, and when it doesn't, it just makes me want to try even harder. And I think that's a good thing. I also think that, you know, it's you know, sometimes maybe I've like given up days to go climbing with friends or events. I've missed friends' weddings. I've missed different things like that to go on an expedition and sit around the world somewhere. Would I give it up? No, but I think that it also makes me want to find more of a balance in my life. And I think we kind of alluded to it of like hormones. And I think as we age and our focus starts to change, you know, maybe the desire to want to go on an expedition and sit somewhere for 8 weeks is less appealing when you may want to spend more time with family and friends and things like that. But I don't think it means I give up climbing. I think it just means my focus and drive switches to different styles of expeditions and things like that, which I think is cool, right? It's like our life's always changing and evolving, and that sort of idea of progression and how we move and how we change. And I think our sports allow for that as well.
Kipp, what do you think about
it? I don't have a super great answer. I have some thoughts. I kind of have been battling back and forth with this question, what the answer is for me. But I think it's a little bit of a mix for me in that, like these women, I'm super driven. And, you know, when I decide to do something, I decide. I'm a very non-committal person, but when I commit, it's 200% committal. But I think just, you know, driven, passion, all of that are kind of equal with life and sport. I'd say like the main, like if I were to say a difference, for me, it's that I actually I think I take life more seriously than I do sport. I really care about building relationships, learning about people, and my job is super important to me. And I really care because my job is a direct impact on other people. If I go do 100 miles, that's not going to impact anyone. I mean, maybe it will if I'm like doing something for a cause or something like that. But for me, when it comes down to impacting people around me, I would say I take my life a little more seriously and I'm a little bit more hard on myself. Whereas if I have a crappy race, I don't really care because it's not hurting anyone. And so I'd say I just take life a little more seriously than I do sport when it comes down to it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, you guys, for those thoughts. I am going to launch into a couple of questions that we got in the last 45 minutes because I think they're some really nice ones. We'll start off with the easiest one, and it is directed to Gilbert specifically. What has been your favorite expedition so far and why?
Whew. Well, I would say two things. Can I have two? Is that okay?
You have to.
I would say from like a pure like alpinism sport aspect, it'd be the Slovak on Denali. That was like, it's a pretty infamous route and it's something that I stood under a long time ago. And ever since then, it was like, I thought it's one of the most beautiful climbs I've ever seen and I wanted to do it. And I think taking 2 years out of my life to go do it, not having success the first time and then going back and having success the second time, I think made it a little more powerful of a climb. It was also kind of cool because the first time I did it was with Chantel Astorga, who's become a really good friend, and that was the very first time we tied in together on anything like that. And so it was pretty cool to just kind of dive into the unknown with somebody and then forge this really strong partnership with. And now we've been on multiple expeditions and around the world. And but I would say the other one is I went to Iran a couple years ago, and from a climbing perspective, it was kind of a bust. We didn't really get to climb what we wanted, and conditions were bad, but it was just a really eye-opening and amazing trip to go somewhere that's been, you know, fairly cut off from a lot of us in the western part of the world and things, and to be able to go and experience something that you read about so much in the news and have such negative viewpoints on from mass media, and to be able to go and actually see it for myself and have this completely different perspective. And I think that's really important, especially in the times we live in today, where our world, whether it's on social media or our phones or whatever, where we just have so much information coming at us so quickly, to realize that still the best way to inform ourselves is by experience. And I think that the more we can really experience things through our own eyes and through our own lenses, we have a better understanding of the world in general, and then also I think each other as humans. And I think that's really important these days.
Thank you. That's great. The next question will be for Kipp, and it is about, is it ever too late to start, especially like in regards to distance running? How much do you think age factors into launching into endurance sports?
No, it's never too late to start. I mean, as a coach now, I have helped a lot of people and a lot of people who are older, and you have to have a lot of patience for it. But the reward at the end has proven to be like amazing, because I truly believe in these people. And if you believe and then you convince them to believe in themselves, I mean, they can do anything. It just comes down to believing in yourself. Sure, if you have an injury or, you know, if you're elderly, you're probably not going to be doing 100 miles. Like, there is a limit, I will say that, but in general, no.
Perfect. Love it. Next question is for Jeannie. Even though it wasn't posed to Jeannie, I think maybe she might have a really good idea of how to answer this one. And it's in regards to when to start leading ice. What are your thoughts on doing X amount of climbs on top rope before you start leading your first ice climb?
Well, based on my own experience, first, I would say this is just personal climbing versus teaching climbing ice, but as much as top roping is really helpful in learning technique and not having the fear factor, and I don't think it's that different than rock in the sense that the mental, emotional commitment side is so much of what's so rewarding with it, and also helps your technique, of course, right? And helps your focus so that you use good technique to lead. So everyone's different, and I think some people might benefit from more top roping first, just to get their confidence level up and their skills up a little bit. But I think I wish that I had learned to lead sooner, you know, that I had more women like this crew here, and I speak to the larger group that didn't exist when I moved to Bozeman. There were very few women ice climbers, and so, you know, you typically went out with your boyfriend or some guys, and you didn't typically lead that much. And I mean, I'm a slow learner, which is a good part of why it's taken me so long to lead things from where I started, but it's also the nature of the game and the techniques and the tools and the partners that we had. So I think if you're psyched on ice climbing, especially as a woman, grab another woman and who's understanding, and, you know, or Kipp, or someone who can actually coach and teach it, like Gilbert, and learn to lead. And you might not do a lot at first, but I think doing that right away just builds so much more confidence and your ability and just the satisfaction, the fulfillment of it is so much bigger than just going out and following, you know. So I say go for it, just like Kipp said about running 100 miles at 50 or 60. If you've got the knees, you know, I think that's what's so beautiful. It's like this group of women that we never had before. It's so changed the game for me to think about things that I never thought were possible. You know, Gilbert taught me a ton in Patagonia that, I mean, as different as our ages might be, I mean, I learned from you so much about, like, why am I like sliding myself and not confident enough to do this stuff? I have the ability, but emotionally, mentally, I wasn't like, I didn't have the hands of all these women and you know, kind of holding me up and saying, you can do this. And I think that's what's so amazing today that we have, especially in this community. It's like, it's transformed into this amazing female community of strong women who aren't afraid to also be gentle and supportive. So I think go for it right away.
So that's a great segue to probably what might end up being the last question. And it was also a question that I had on my sheet, so this is perfect, but it's about mentorship. And maybe Gilbert, you can start us off with talking about the importance, or is it important to find a mentor, and what does that look like? Does it need to be somebody at your same skill level? Or what are your thoughts on just mentorship in general and its importance?
I think mentorship is probably one of the most important things. I think in any aspect of sport and life, I think, but I think a mentor comes in many different facets, and I think they can be an equal, they can be somebody that you don't even know, they can be your life partner, they can be whatever you want it to be. But I think it's important that we have a mentor, and if we're talking specifically sport, you know, I think it's kind of like what Jeannie said. It's like somebody that gives you, that like shows you your own sense of confidence. And it's like not only somebody to kind of help you in a skill set or a strength to like kind of progress in your own sport, but I think more so to like be that partner that can hold the end of the rope, and when you're up there scared or pushing, can like give you the confidence to keep going, because you know that they're going to hold the end of the rope no matter what. And if times get tough, they're going to be there. You know, if you're in a storm, if you fall, if whatever, they're going to be there for you. And I think that you know, I think some of the older generation, you know, it's like Jeannie, like she learned to climb with a lot of older men and didn't have that many women. And like now she's like, in the last handful of years, she's surrounded herself with this awesome community of women. And it's like she said, it's changed like her aspect of climbing and like what she's learned from climbing. And I think that's really important. And I think a mentor can be male, female, whatever it needs to be, but somebody that gives you the confidence to push yourself and not just to ride the back of the rope and to summit these mountains. But at the end of the day, you're like, what did I do? I just tied in and got drugged to the top and drugged back down. And it's like, no, somebody that like you go up and maybe you fail with, and you guys teach yourself these skills, and you know, you kind of, you learn together. And I think that's so important. I think that's a huge role of mentorship. And I was fortunate to have it in different aspects of my life. And I had some that were equals, and I had some that I learned from that were, you know, more skilled than me and took me under their wings, and I learned things from. And then I've also been fortunate to learn right alongside and bumble and fall and mess up, but they were right there with me. And yeah, so I think it's huge.
Kipp, how important is mentorship in more endurance-based sports like running ultras or big bike races? Where does that play a role with you?
I'd say I think it's really important as well, but maybe not as important in that there's less risk factor involved. Whereas you really want to have someone mentoring you with that risk factor. But Anne kind of nailed the main points of why mentorship is, why someone would want it and why it's important. I think if you don't have it, it's worth seeking out and finding what or who that is. Yeah.
Great. Jeannie, did you want to add anything about mentorship and its role, the role it's played in your career?
I would just add that I think it's it can be really atypical of what we used to think of mentorship as women in climbing and maybe even as ultra running and things that are longer, big endurance adventures. Just that you can find it through your partners, through your friends. And like Gilbert said, they may be better at the sport, or they may just be mentally better at bringing you through something and giving you the confidence and holding the other end and making you realize, no, come on, keep going. You've got this. You really can do this. And they could be, you know, half the climber physically, but mentally be there for you. And I think, to me, that's what I found in never having had real mentorship when I was younger, just being more like Kipp, where I was just super doggedly determined and driven and just had to move. But later realizing the benefits of, and breaking down my own barriers through doing it with friends, and each of us having a different thing to offer each other. And like Gilbert said, I think it can come through male partners for sure. I've just, maybe because of where my life trajectory has been, it's really come through a lot of women lately in my life, and so I've been grateful for that. But it comes in many forms, is what I'm trying to say, and openness, I think, is one of the biggest things that I feel I've learned is just be open. Like, don't put barriers up for yourself. Be open to learning from so many different types of friends and partners and experiences, and never presume something that, for them or for yourself. And that's kind of how we grow and learn, or I've grown and learned so much more than when I used to sort of put things in a box.
Perfect. Yeah. Does anybody have anything to add? Final comments, notes?
I think
Anybody?
to just conclude my thoughts, it's just, and give any piece of advice that I could,
Yeah.
from what I've learned, is just be excited to fail. It's what's brought me where I am today. I mean, when I first started, we'll just take, I started with triathlon, then I moved to more like into mountain stuff as I've aged. But we'll just take my first triathlon, for example. I still did not know how to clip out of the clipless pedals. And this is before my first race. The day before, I literally fell over 3 times, and I started the race the next day with like all kinds of stuff on me. But I figured it out. and I probably didn't have a good race either, but it's just the process of going through it and being okay with being completely naive, being okay with not being confident, because it will come, and just a willingness to fail.
It's pretty tricky to put yourself out there sometimes. Yeah. Gilbert, Jeannie, agreed? Feeling good? Cool. Nice. Well, Kipp, that was perfect closing words. And thanks for doing my job for me. Again, thank you 3 for being here and taking an hour out of your day to hang out with a bunch of folks online. Maybe next time we'll get to do this live and in person at Uphill. Hopefully, maybe in the fall, who knows. But I appreciate everybody's willingness to log on and have some more eyes on the screen. I know everybody's having a lot of screen time, but I think it's very meaningful that we all keep connecting and keep inspiring each other and keep uplifting each other. And so thank you. And thanks again, Gilbert, for being there for the community and standing at the ready for whatever happens. Yeah. So next week we have something really special. Whit Magro has decided to do his Gambling in the Winds presentation next week, and so that'll be worth tuning into. If you haven't heard, there's a sweet new route that he was able to complete in the Wind River Range, and I'll let him tell everybody all about it. But tune in next week, and that'll be the topic.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.